Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Undercooled. Today, once again, Steve and I have the pleasure of having a special guest on the show. This time, we're going to be having a conversation with Robert Talbert, who has, well, I don't want to spoil the whole thing, but has written a really great book that everyone out there should read, and we're here to discuss it today. So, let's hand it over to Steve for some introductions and get us started.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to see you again, Robert. I think it was 3 years ago that you came into Michigan.
Yeah, that's right. It seems like a long time ago. I guess it
That's
was.
right. Yeah. And you were telling us about how you were moving away from using the term mastery grading,
Right.
which was
Yeah.
all the vogue back then. And
hmm
that you told me this great story about your kid and his swim team and how that
hmm
kind of inspired some of this concept and the renaming of all of it to grading for growth. But I digress. Let's first hear a little bit about who you are because I had seen your blog many years ago about flip teaching. I know you wrote a book on flip teaching. So how did you ever become a math professor? And how did you get into all of this pedagogical and grading theory?
Sure. Well, first of all, Steve and Tim, thanks for having me on your podcast. I really appreciate the opportunity. So, for the listeners, in case you didn't know, Steve and Tim send me the questions or the outlines of the questions beforehand. And the first one asks, "Who is Robert Talbert?" That's by far the hardest question on the list, and I've been thinking about it all week. I ask myself that question every day. So, I'm a professor in the math department at Grand Valley State University, and how I got into thinking about new and different kinds of pedagogies like flipped learning and alternative grading and such. So this is my 30th, or coming on almost 30 years out of graduate school. I've been teaching since I finished my PhD in 1997 from Vanderbilt, and I was a teaching assistant for my time as a graduate student there, which at Vanderbilt meant that you had full control over your classes. So I was like the professor of record for 3 calculus classes a year, which I've come to understand as an insane workload for PhD students. But I just thought it was like everybody did this at the time. And I'd never taught before at that time. This is back in the mid 90s, and never taught a class before, but I'd done a lot of tutoring before, and I was actually still doing tutoring at that time. And I was trying to acclimate myself to classroom teaching, which is a different sort of animal. And I had a sort of a mentor who was an upper division student, a fifth year student who was helping out with my teaching. And he said, I don't know if you ever heard about this idea of collaborative learning and group work in your classes, which is kind of a new idea in math at the time. And he said, maybe you ought to think about breaking your students up into small groups and having them work in small groups because it can leverage your tutoring experience to help you kind of feel more at home in the classroom. I thought, that sounds like a good idea. So I tried it out, and I really liked how that worked. And that was a very unusual way to teach a calculus course at that time. In the mid 90s, there was a great amount of upheaval in how math instruction was being conceived of. It's sometimes called the math wars back in those days, and it was the heyday of what's called calculus reform, and people were beginning to question the idea of using straight lecture techniques and a lot of super abundant amounts of theory, and thinking more about group work, active learning, use of technology at the time. Graphing calculators were becoming a thing at the time. And this math war was playing itself out in my department at Vanderbilt. And it just seemed like the people who were on the innovation side of the math wars were having a lot more fun than anybody else was in the classroom, and we're getting better results too. And so I kind of stuck with that idea of thinking differently about how math can be taught. And I was fortunate enough to land a really good tenure track position straight out of graduate school at a small liberal arts college in Indiana, where I was one of 2 people in the math department, and both of us in the math department were very much kindred spirits in terms of you doing innovative things in the classroom. And so I got a lot of professional help and just kind of stuck from there. I first got into flip instruction, which is maybe the thing you mentioned, Steve, that I wrote a book on some years ago, because I was teaching at another small liberal arts college, also in Indiana, and it was a small course that was only meeting once a week, and I was designing this course from scratch. It was a brand new course. And there was just no way to be able to teach that course with a lecture style. It was just physically impossible. There was not enough time in the day to do it. And so I discovered flipped instruction, or the inverted classroom, it was called, through research and just what else was out there. There was very little out there about that at the time. And redesigned the course around this whole idea, and that first book is sort of a chronicle of what I learned and the mistakes I made throughout all that. So ever since those experiences, it seems like students always seem to be better served through what we would call innovative pedagogies, including today, what David Clarke and I wrote this book about, alternative grading, that I think is the latest iteration of all that.
That's fantastic. And of course, you had a blog you were one of the original bloggers, I think.
It seems like it, yeah.
before YouTube and all of that. I must say, I was a math major as an undergrad. And I think the math wars have been going, it's been more like 100 years war. Because
it does feel that way.
Ever since Whitehead and Russell axiomatized math, that was pretty crazy. And I'm an old guy, so I remember the new math when I was in second grade, where they had us using these little things called number aids that were like a little abacus to learn factors of 10. And that was incredibly controversial. And Robert Feynman wrote all about the math wars in the 60s when he was a professor at Caltech, because he was very upset about how math was being taught. He concluded, there's no way to win this war. He surrendered.
It's a war of attrition, it seems like, more than anything else. It does seem like it's been going on forever. The history of mathematics is just nothing but a never-ending cycle of innovation and tradition sparring with each other, to put it charitably, it seems like.
I'll just never forget my math professor telling us that we should all look at textbooks that were written before the 1920s, because he said that when you read something like that, you read like, how do you prove Stokes' theorem? And in that book, you take a cylinder, a cylindrical piece of steel, and you heat it up and you make these measurements, and see, it works.
That's the proof, right?
Yeah.
So there's
before it was axiomatized, that's how they proved things, because, math was invented to help people understand the world around them.
So it was interesting. Very true.
But we digress. So you were very involved in pedagogy. And of course, I learned a lot about what you're doing through my friend Eric Mazur, who, I've known since 1996, I think, when he started talking about using TI-83 calculators as clickers. This was before the clicker. And when he realized that it's not about the lecture, it's about engaging students and having them teach each other, which is pretty much the same as team-based learning and project-based learning and all of that. And so he told me I really needed to take a look at your website. But something happened. Something happened between when you were doing all the inverted or flipped teaching, when you got into assessment. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into alternative assessments? And of course, I realize there's a whole history there, a progression, an evolution. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. First of all, I appreciate the shout out to Eric Mazur. Eric's one of my personal heroes, and I'm really flattered. I'm very grateful to have a good relationship with him. And he reads my stuff, and I read his stuff, and he's just absolutely brilliant. So always learning from him. It's kind of hard to say. I think if I go back even all the way to the beginning of my teaching experience, back during graduate school at Vanderbilt. It's an interesting time in your life, in your career as a professor, when you're teaching in graduate school, because you're both getting grades and giving grades at the same time. And I think that might be the only time in our careers where your grades are coming at us from both directions, both coming and going. And I was always the kind of person that got pretty good grades in my classes. I sometimes got very good grades in my classes, and this was sort of a point of pride for me. It's kind of what I built my whole self on, was the getting of good grades. And it was like I could do school like nobody else. But when I got into graduate school and started giving the grades out, I had a whole lot of questions that started coming up, because I was seeing, as I'm sure your listeners, anybody who's in the classroom knows, I mean, you give a grade. Sometimes that grade seems to be, you can give the grade and it can be properly computed, tabulated, whatever. But then there's this secondary impression you give of the grade, like, is this really accurate? When I give a student an A in a class, does the student really have what I consider to be quote unquote A level understanding? And I was finding, and a lot of us still do find, that we have sometimes students get grades that really accurately reflect what they know. Sometimes students get grades that are false positives, like high grades, but there's very little understanding between the ears. Like when you actually sit down and talk with a student, you just don't sense mastery or a grasp of anything. And there's also false negatives, which in some ways is even worse. This is with students who truly seem engaged and truly seem like they're grasping the material, but for whatever reason, or whatever combination of reasons, just doesn't translate into a high grade. And I was seeing that a lot in graduate school. At Vanderbilt's a lot like University of Michigan. It's an elite school. It's a highly ranked school. It attracts extremely high level students. And most of them were doing pretty well in their classes, but sometimes students would get a grade, and I was just, I don't think so. I just don't think that this person, when I talk to them, I have questions about this. But you shove that under the rug, right, when you're a new teacher, because you don't want to think about that this is like the very ground on which we stand, right? I mean, I don't want to start questioning this. But a few things, I think these three things I would say happened kind of very close to each other that kind of started making me realize I had to change something about what I was doing. First of all, you mentioned my son's swim class. This is a real thing. So I was, my son, who was, he's like super old now, but he was like 7 at the time, 6 or 7. Was taking a swim class at my university, and the swim class wasn't a real class. I mean, but they did get grades of a sort. There was this report card of sorts that had level 1 through level 10. Okay. And like different like little faces for level 1, like level 10 was like these little icons, and even below each level, it lists like what the swimmer is able to do. Okay, like level 5 is I can swim on my back for 50 meters or something like that. I can't remember what it is. All these little explicit, observable skills that if you do them all, you are considered to be at level whatever, level 5, 6. Level 1 is like, it's great. You can get in the water. Like that's maybe like for kids who are like 3 years old or something, up to like level 10, which is like you are now ready to compete with, high school age students in a swim meet. And when he finished the course, he had all of his levels checked off to where he was, and underneath every skill that he was able to do, that the instructor saw that he was able to do, was highlighted in blue. And so he gave that report card, and I just thought, this is fantastic. I mean, this report card is like an asset mindset. Okay, it tells you what the student can do, and it also tells you what the student should continue to work on if you want to get better. And I thought, what a difference that would be. I mean, I immediately thought, what if I did this in my calculus class? Like I had like level 1 through level 5 or something, and level 5 is an A, level 4 is a B or something like that. And just said, this is not a judgment or an audit of you. This is just simply a report. It's a report card that tells you what you can do and where you still need to work on stuff. So it's not an accusation or something that's intended to chop you down to size or a penalty. It's just information. And that would be great, because the second thing that was happening, it was a specific instance. I was teaching at our downtown Grand Rapids campus, and I live in Allendale, Michigan, which is where the main campus is located. It's a 30-minute drive. And we have a bus service that goes back and forth between the campuses. And I was teaching downtown. I got done with class that night. I went and sat down in the back of the bus, and 2, 3 of my students from this class came and sat about 4 rows in front of me, and they didn't know I was there because it was kind of dark. And I thought, oh, this is going to be good, right? I'm going to hear them
Yeah,
really,
yeah, yeah.
lay into me in this class. But it was actually worse than being laid into, because all they would talk about was, well, if I get a 62 on this one, then I can pass that one, and I need to get an 83 on the final exam to get the. It was these were students who were not good at the calculus that we were studying, but they were like Fields medalist level mathematicians when it came to trying to figure out what sort of point allocations they need to have to get this over here. And I was just sitting back going like, aren't you going to talk about Stokes' theorem? Aren't you going to? I would love to hear you tell me how much you hate Stokes' theorem at this point, because I would rather you hate that than love the numbers and the grades, right? Because it's like the material in Calculus 3 is merely like a delivery vector for points. And I just thought, I hate this. This is not why I got into this business. And those two things happened about the same time. I thought it would be cool to like replace everything with points with like just simply marking off levels of swim. And the third thing that happened was that fall, later in the year, I was teaching another calculus class, and I had a student who I write about this in the book as my true origin story. A student who was very talented, very bright, but just needed a little more time than anybody else to really grasp the material. And the problem is the way that the course was set up with grading, of course, is like pretty traditional. It's like you have a test one on, September 10th and test two on October 3rd. And if you don't get extra time to master the material, you got to have it done by this particular point in time, or you just don't get it at all. And the student just gradually slipped further and further behind and had some severe mental problems by the end of the mental health problems by the end of the semester. In fact, she didn't make it to the end of the semester. She just dropped off the face of the earth after failing a couple of exams. And I thought, what a waste, what a waste of really good, talented student potential. And it's all because of the grade system. And so this whole perfect storm came up, and I just at that point just said, like, I don't know what I'm going to replace my grading system with. I don't even know if there is a replacement for this grading system. Maybe it's like my son's swim class. I don't know. But I'm just going to go and invent something and put it in next semester, like 4 weeks from now, because I can't do this anymore. So it's finally coming to terms with the deep questions I had about the validity of grading systems and what it's and the reality of what it does to people. Finally coming home to roost and finally coming to terms with those things that drove me into thinking about this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so much there that I think many of us will resonate with. And two things in particular that I notice. The first is, so for my research background, once upon a time, I actually worked a lot in sort of psychometrics and really asking that question of how do we quantifiably and accurately and validly measure learning. And this dichotomy between grades and measuring learning, the two things are correlated to each other weekly, but there's so much that goes into a grade that is not learning, and there's so much learning that happens that is independent of the grade. And I was recently talking to one of our graduate students who was essentially saying to me, as an undergraduate, I got so good at being a student, I kind of forgot how to learn. And now that I'm a graduate student, my job is to learn instead of to be a student. And navigating that transition is really difficult for students who have mastered the game of school rather than the skill of learning.
That's absolutely right. And it doesn't really have to be that way. I mean, we can do grading in a way that really sort of focuses on the learning process, okay, the feedback loops that are really at the heart of any significant learning process you do. There's a guitar in your background. I have guitars upstairs too. And when you're learning the guitar, I mean, that's a feedback loop. I mean, you try to strum, the chord and it sounds terrible. It's like, okay, it's okay that it's terrible because that's my first time ever touching the instrument. I shouldn't be judged on that. Okay, what I need is some way forward, like somebody or a recording or a teacher or a YouTube video or something that's going to show me what I'm doing wrong and allow me to redo it. And that's how I become a guitarist. Okay, it's not by suddenly picking up the guitar and like you're a prodigy right out of the gate. I mean, I feel like we expect a lot of students to just be prodigies right out of the gate. And some of them survive this process and they become graduate students and get PhDs. Some others, like myself, are not prodigious in any meaningful sense. And so we have to sort of figure out the learning process on our own. And we're working against the grading system rather than with it. And that's what I hope, the whole movement of alternative grading is starting to change.
Yep.
Yeah,
Well, now that we're talking,
Go ahead.
well, since we're talking about alternative grading now, the phrase has been dropped. I was thinking we could get into our main topic. So we have the story of sort of how several of us have come to question traditional grading schemes. And grading for growth is the topic of the day. So for those who haven't read the book or maybe even haven't heard of your book, can you give us just a couple minute brief overview of what grading for growth is and what's the essence of this grading strategy?
Sure. So, Grading for Growth is really three things. It's the name of a book that I co-wrote with my colleague David Clarke. So it's a book. It's also a Substack publication called Grading for Growth, gradingforgrowth.com, where David and I and a whole host of guest authors post something every Monday about grading and grading reform and grading experiences. And so that's, again, gradingforgrowth.com. Grading for Growth is also sort of a catchphrase for a philosophy about how we evaluate student work. Okay, so where grading, if you will, is thought of, it's not a numerical focused ranking, sorting, filtering process whereby we pretend to measure learning with grades. I mean, Tim, you mentioned measuring learning and all that. Grades do not measure anything. Okay, they are labels that are the result of professional judgment calls, and it's okay that they are. Okay, there's nothing wrong with this, but we need to be honest with ourselves and with our students. I'm not hooking you up to an EEG machine and measuring your brain waves when I hand you a product rule question in calculus and saying, well, if your EEG waves peak at certain enough times during a 10-minute period, then you're going to get an A. That's a measurement, and we're not doing that. Okay, what I'm doing is I'm getting a piece of work from you, and I'm making a judgment call about how it stacks up against clearly defined standards and whether you've demonstrated enough mastery in my professional view to merit it. That's all grading is like this. And so, in what is we call alternative grading, and some use Grading for Growth as a pseudonym for that, it's aligning our evaluation of student work and with a more natural sort of feedback loop based approach. A feedback loop is just simply, it's a process we're all familiar with because we engage in it multiple times every day. You're trying to learn something, be able to do something, whether it's write an essay or take a derivative or play the guitar, and you try it. Okay, you try it once and you get feedback on your process relative to some what you might consider success. Like when you play a scale on a piano, you should have a sense of what a successful playing of a scale should sound like. Okay, and you have to get feedback that tells you, okay, your standard for this was here. Your performance of that was over here, and maybe that's good enough, maybe it isn't. And if it isn't good enough, then what you have to do in the feedback loop is to make sense of the feedback, okay, figure out what the person or object giving you the feedback is saying to you, and then convert that into some sort of a plan for how you're going to do it again. And then you go back to the keyboard, you go back to the piece of paper, you go back to the computer, and you do it again. And you just keep this iterative loop process happening. Grading for Growth is a philosophy where we align evaluation of student work with participation in a feedback loop. If I had to put it in a nutshell, that's how I would describe it. There's more to it than that, but that's the essence in my view.
So I really enjoyed when you started talking about what's wrong with traditional grading, where you talked about simply taking percentages for all sorts of different kinds of assessments and then trying to find a weighted average amongst them. And you pointed out that I don't know if you said it like this. I mean, you gave the example of averaging zip codes in a state because it's meaningless. But that really struck home with me because in material science, one of the hardest things in introductory material science for students to grasp is understanding the difference between the composition of an alloy and the fraction of phases in an alloy. And the reason it's complicated for students to why they get confused is because both of those results are represented as a percentage. And
Right.
a percentage always has a hidden unit that just because you divided it out doesn't mean that it's not really there. And that's
Right.
why it's difficult for students because they go, what do you mean? They're both percentages. It's got to be the same thing. And they're radically different things. And,
Right.
here we are in the age of learning management systems like Canvas and Blackboard. And it's hardwired into the system that we must all give these weighted averages to get a grade.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to fight against that. But so
Yeah.
that really resonated with me when I read about that. And it's always bothered me that as scientists, I always tell my graduate students, you can't just give me a number. You've got to give me an error bar, right? You got to give me the accuracy of that number, and you have to understand where that error bar comes from, because it could be systematic errors, it could be just your instrument resolution, whatever it is, you better have an error bar. And then we turn around and go into our classroom and give students grades on a 0 to 100 scale, which we of course compress to a 70 to 100 scale because no one's supposed to get below a 70.
Right.
And then we look at our list of grades if it's a large class, and we decide the difference between an A minus and a B plus on something like 0.01% because there appears to be a big gap there, as if that has any meaning in itself. And then we draw this line, and it's so arbitrary, but the error bar for measuring learning is probably 20%, which is our whole range of scores.
Yeah, and 20% of what exactly? Even
That's right.
so it's even worse than you say, Steve, because the fact is, and we point this out in the book that. And the thing about zip codes you mentioned, that's my go-to analogy. That just because zip codes are numbers, but that doesn't make them numerical data, right? So Tim, you're in psychometric studies, and anybody who knows a bit of statistics knows that there's these different flavors of data. You have like categorical, you have ordinal data, and you have ratio and interval data. Basically, you can split them roughly into either numerical or non-numerical. Categorical being just labels. Okay, zip codes are categorical data. Okay, they're labels on things, but it's simply because we don't want to write down the physical location that corresponds to a zip code, right? I mean, instead of writing Allendale, Michigan, we write 49401. Okay, it's no problem. But then when we start doing statistics with these things, like even just simple averages or summing them or taking the square root of them, or like what does the square root of a zip code mean? I mean, you can do it, but it doesn't have any meaning to it. So what is the point of doing this? It's like taking the square root of my name, okay? Because it is a name, it's a label on things. And it's okay that and grades, the thing to realize is that grades are not numerical data. They are not measurements in any meaningful sense. They are simply labels that are shortcuts for an evaluation that is too long for all of us to write out. Okay, those of us who use rubrics, for example, I mean, we have rubrics that do exactly this. On the one side of the rubric, you've got like this lengthy verbal description of what a outstanding or excellent or whatever label work you want is, and then it maps it over to a number. Okay, so that number is just a shorthand for all this this verbal data that's on the other side of the rubric, and we write the number instead of the verbal data because the number is one character and the verbal data is like 100 characters, and that's okay. It's okay that we do that. When it ceases to be okay is when we forget that these are not really numbers in any meaningful sense. So we pretend like they're numbers, just like reading off of a thermometer or something like that. Now, you can average thermometer readings because those are actually numerical data. Okay, those are interval ratio data. It kind of depends on how you think of it, but they're numerical nonetheless, and it's valid to do stats with them. It is really not valid to do statistics with grades. Okay, and that's a shocking. And when I remember the first time I had this realization, I was like, wow, that's maybe the biggest problem with traditional grading is that we assign all these numbers to things, and then we kind of forget that they were assigned to things. Okay, they just didn't come out of a machine or they come out of a sensor reading or something. They're judgment calls. They're basically labels. And in the earliest days of grading, back in the 18th century, they were just simply text labels on things. The first recorded instance of anything like a grade was not until 1785. For most of the lifespan of higher education, there was nothing remotely like grades. It was not even a thing until the 18th century. And the first reported uses of gradings were just like adjectives, like good, really good, not really good. I mean, they were Latin, okay, so they weren't actually those labels, but that's what they were. They were just simply descriptive adjectives of things. And does it sound stupid to take the standard deviation of a bunch of verbal adjectives? Well, yeah, it does, because those aren't even like the right data. And it's equally crazy to think about taking standard deviations of numbers that are simply shorthands for those adjectives. So yeah, there's all kinds of statistical problems, and we don't like thinking about this because in higher ed, we're really super into optimizing for things that can be quantified. That's why we have course evaluations, which is like the flip side of grading, and it's equally pernicious. And that might be my next diatribe, against. Don't even get me started on that. But do you hate course evaluations? Well, you should hate grades, traditional grades too, because they're kind of two sides of the same coin. Those where the students grade us. And so it's kind of ridiculous to think about. And every time a student marks a 1 through 5 on a course evaluation, that's not a measurement. Okay, that's a student opinion, and the actual verbal data is way more interesting than the number, right? It's got the actual information in it, whereas the number is just so compressed that it's like if I open up my course evaluations and I see 3.9 out of 5, I mean, what even is that? What does that tell me to do? There's no information in that number, even, much less an average of it.
I hope at the end of this discussion, we circle back to this in terms of this actually a complicated thing. This concept of abusing numbers is very complex, and I want to come back and talk later about how do we discuss this with our students when we change the grading, because man, did I run into a buzzsaw with the students being very upset that I changed the way I was grading. But let's go through and first understand more about, sort of the 4 pillars of the grading for growth approach to alternative grading, because I think that's where the core of the practical side is. Now, I love that you broke up your book into the theory section, and then you had this amazing case study section where you showed how many other people were using your system, and then you ended up with a workbook of how do you actually do it yourself. So I had never read a book like that before. I thought that was really interesting, and I got to say, I'm glad I got through the theory part because I was getting a little bored. But as soon as I got into those case studies, wow, it's like it opened my mind up. I'm like, what great ideas. But let's start with the pillars. So can you describe them?
Sure. So it's the way what you said, Steve. It's actually the way the book sort of evolved is a little bit backwards from that. We actually went and did the case studies first and wrote the rest of the book later. Because I mean, as you indicated, I mean, the case studies in the book are by far the most interesting part of the book, and they're the real gold mine. And I just sometimes tell people just skip everything but the case studies. You can come back to the other stuff later because it's like super boring, and then you'll have a basis for understanding it. So David and I have been experimenting ourselves with alternative grading methods in our classes for some time, and we decided we want to write a book. And so we started off by designing the book around like one chapter for every specific flavor of alternative grading that you could possibly think of, like specifications grading or standards-based grading or ungrading or contract-based grading or whatever. And then we realized that we probably going to need to get outside our bubble and talk to some other people. So we did, and we started getting these case studies in. And the 4 pillars of alternative grading we developed deductively or inductively, I should say, from observing other people's practices. Like every time a person was doing an alternative system, it's something non-traditional, anything non-traditional, and it seemed to be working for them, we made a note of what they were doing, and then we tried to distill, because we're mathematicians, we're real into like abstraction and underlying principles and stuff. What do all these working systems have in common? And the four pillars are what emerged from that. So it's not so much of people following our system, we're following their system. And the system that we have, these four pillars, the first one is having clear standards. Okay, clear standards. And by clear standards, I just mean what students should be able to do in a class and what they need to be able to do to show you that they can do it is clear from the student standpoint. Okay, so for example, if you're teaching Calculus 1, there's all these derivative rules you have to be able to do, right? And so sometimes you might be tempted to write as a learning outcome, I want you to know the product rule. Know the product rule. So, well, of course we want people to know the product rule, but what does that mean? I mean, what would you have to do, Steve and Tim, to show me that you know the product rule? What do I even mean by know the product rule? Do I mean you should be able to state it? Do I mean you should be able to use it? Should you be able to prove it? Is it all those things? I mean, I don't know, and neither does the student. So you replace all that stuff with a clear statement, a concrete action verb statement that clearly lays out what you're supposed to be able to do, and then what constitutes acceptable evidence of doing it. So you might say, instead of know the product rule, you say you should be able to compute the derivative of a product of two functions. Okay, so that's a clearer statement that tells students what they should be able to do, and you can go practice that. Okay, speaking of feedback loops, I mean feedback loops and deliberate practice are very tightly intertwined, and so this is something you can now practice. Okay, so that's what clear standards are, and that's the very first pillar. That has nothing really. I mean, it has a lot to do with alternative grading, but it doesn't belong to alternative grading. Having clear learning standards for your class is just course design 101, and regardless of how you do your grading, that's something that everybody should be doing, I feel like. The second pillar,
there was a distinction you made, right?
Yeah.
We all, many years ago, lots of education research showed that it was very important to actually write down what we expected our students to learn in every lecture when we were all still lecturing. So we all realized very quickly that one of the problems was we had these grand expectations and we had like 25 things we expected someone to learn in our 50-minute lecture, and that was too many. So we all cut back and tried to make it like, 6 to 8 outcomes that we were expecting our students would learn from a lesson. But you make the point that these standards can't be quite so fine-grained. And I think this is the first time I've heard anyone talk about standards in the sense that it should be sort of on the module level, not the course level, that's too course grained, not on the lecture level, but something in between that you could actually use to make these measurements or to look. Can you talk a little bit about how fine-grained these standards should be?
Right. So when you teach a class, like you say, Steve, I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of things that our students are going to be exposed to. And many of them, most of them, if not all, are interesting. And you hope students catch them and are inspired by them and get some meaning out of them. But you can't assess them all, right? There's just no way to do it. And so when you're building a course, you have to make a decision about, of all the things that students are going to see and do and experience in my class, which one or ones rise to the level of this? These are important enough that I'm going to assess you on them. I'm going to give you something to do that you have to give back to me, and I'm going to make a judgment call as to whether you have reached a certain, or you met a standard or not. I'm going to lay out what that standard looks like. So I think I referred to those as assessment level objectives. Course level objectives are, as you say, coarser grained, and these are pretty grandiose. And then when you start saying, like, I want you to appreciate the role of calculus in the world, I mean, you can say that if you want to, but you're not going to assess that.
Right.
I mean, maybe you do. Maybe appreciation is something that you want to assess, but then you have to push that down a level to the assessment level and say, okay, since I'm going to assess this, what do I expect students to be able to do show their appreciation. This is starting to like give me a gift or something. I don't know how you would do this.
Yeah.
And then what would constitute acceptable evidence that you appreciate something sufficiently? So you have to make a choice about some of these finer grained objectives, that things that you just sort of encounter in a course. They might be like nice to haves, but not necessarily must haves. Like I'm teaching discrete mathematics right now, and students are learning about for example, how many bits are needed to store an integer of a certain size. Okay, so that's an important topic. I have to ask myself, and I hope students see that and think it's cool and they get something out of it. And I have to ask myself though, when I'm building that course, is this so cool and so important that I want to test students on it? Because maybe it isn't. Maybe it's just like a passing thing, and if you get it, great. If you don't get it, that's all right. But there's some things in the course that you really want to give a check on them and say, like, I need to know that you are able to, for example, convert a number from decimal to binary by hand. Okay, that's also cool, but it's more than cool. It's important. Like this is an important facet of the course that I really need to see that you're able to do this before I can let you move on somehow. And so that level of objectives is what ties into the assessment and the grading scheme. It's not everything. And you try to keep it small because you don't want to grade all the time.
Yeah, and we have the problem in engineering. There's two kinds of things we're always trying to teach. One are concepts, right? But concepts are a very different beast than doing all the problem solving. So I tried to break down in mine what is the right standard for being able to understand why a concept is the way it is, how to apply that concept and all of that. So a conceptual standard and then a problem solving standard. And that limited me to two standards for every module, because it's a big intro course, so it's just every week. It's a kilometer wide and a nanometer deep. But there's always a component that I need to deliver the knowledge to my students for the next course they're going to take. That was important. It's funny, once we had a whole review of our curriculum. And so we started at the intro course, and the professors would stand up and say, this is what I did. And the lab instructor, who was the junior level course, would come in and goes, I don't know, Steve. You say you taught them phase diagrams, but they got to my class and they didn't know phase diagrams. So I had to add some extra lectures. And then the next level, the senior design said, I don't know, Wayne, you might have added those extra lectures, but they still didn't know phase diagrams. So I added some more lectures, which is kind of funny because the solution is not to add lectures.
Yeah, let's just keep it. It's like when someone's trying to speak to someone who doesn't speak English and you just talk louder. That's not how that works. Right?
That's right.
That's exactly it.
I just started laughing in the middle of that, but it was very illuminating. But still, that's what I try to do with a conceptual and a problem solving, because things may be algorithmic when you do problem solving, but it's important they learn those algorithms, because
absolutely, yeah,
that saves them tons of time, and it's a conventional wisdom they're supposed to have by the time they graduate. So does that make sense? I mean, you didn't write about that explicitly in your book.
No, but that totally makes sense, and I think every course is like that to some degree. You have. I tend to think of every course as designed with a 3D axis in mind. You have the x-axis, which is like your basic skills, your computations, your algorithms, and that sort of thing. You have the y-axis, which is applications and high-level concepts, and the z-axis, which is like engagement of some sort. Like those three things all work together. They're all orthogonal to each other. I can use that word orthogonal because I'm talking about a bunch of engineers here. They're all kind of orthogonal to each other, and they all support each other mutually. And
you put
success
it into
in one
vector
axis
space
only is not really enough, right? You want success on all three axes, or otherwise that's what an A should mean, right? Your excellence in all three directions.
Yeah, this is something that I remember Steve and I had a polite discussion about at one point, was kind of the difference of when you're in this vector space of learning, there's an important distinction between just distance away from the origin, which is, I think, what a sort of traditional ABC letter grade is at least trying to capture, versus having a more nuanced understanding of which aspects or, which dimensions in the space were the ones that students succeeded at which
That's an
levels.
excellent analogy.
So we've talked a lot about the importance of feedback to students already, but now that we're talking about grades again, I know another really important pillar in the book is this idea that marks should indicate progress. And
Right.
certainly the idea of a growth mindset is something that I think has gained some understanding in the popular consciousness now. And it's something that I think we want to instill in our students. And so I'd like to hear more on your take of how do we essentially grade to indicate progress, and how can we use that to cultivate, growth mindset in our students?
Sure. So a mark, by the word mark, I'm just meaning like whatever it is you actually put on student work. It's a Canadianism that I adopted wholeheartedly since we're practically in Canada anyway, since we're in Michigan. So you put it, not every professor chooses to put marks on work at all. That's the impetus behind so-called ungrading, is that you don't mark student work. It doesn't get an 82 or even like an adjective. It's just you just get feedback, and then the grade for the course is determined collaboratively at the end by just sort of having a sit down with the instructor and going through all your work and seeing what you think you got. But if you do put a mark on student work, which I think most people are still doing, I certainly still do mark student work, it should be something that indicates like you said, Tim, like how far away from the origin you are, and which direction needs the most compensation. And this is not like a really alien concept to academics, because there's two things about higher education that are bread and butter higher education concepts where we get marks that indicate progress. And one of them is when you submit an article to a journal. When you submit an article to a journal, imagine if it gets sent back to you with an 82 out of 100 on it. Okay, that's a mark. Does it tell you what to do next? I mean, I don't think there are any journals that do this. There could be, and I wouldn't put it past some publishing houses to do it. But that's kind of crazy, right? I mean, 82 out of 100. What am I supposed to do with that? Is it going to be published? Do I need to tweak it a little bit? Do I need to tweak it a lot? Do I need to just completely start over? Is it good enough? I mean, how far off am I just by looking at the 82? Now, you could say, well, you could put an 82 on that paper submission, but then the reviewers are going to give you lots of detailed feedback, and that's all well and good. But I would like to have like what you normally have with a journal submission, which is like accepted or minor revision or major revision. So that's a little mark that indicates it's a summary, a little nutshell of where you are in the process. Okay, to kind of set the stage for how you should accept the feedback. Okay. When I get a paper, submit a paper to a journal, it comes back major revision. I'm thinking like, oh, I got to make a decision whether I want to keep working on this or not. If it's minor revision, I'm thinking like, cool, okay, it's pretty close. Yeah, let me read the feedback, and it puts me in the right frame of mind to accept or reject the feedback. An 82 doesn't put me in any frame of mind. It's just like, I don't even know what this is. It's like, why write 82? Just write revision. That's a mark that indicates progress. And the other area where we see this all the time in academia is in our own tenure reviews. I mean, when you go up for tenure, you submit your portfolio to the dean or whoever, and you don't get it back with like an 82 on it. You get it back with like, you hopefully get it back with says tenure on it, but what you hope for is you submit it before your tenure, either like 3 years out, and you get some feedback on it, and maybe it's got a marking of some sort on it, and annual performance reviews. I mean, we constantly are putting marks on our own work that indicate progress, but we fail to do this with our students, and so it baffles me sometimes that we don't. So I mean, there's any number of ways that you could simply do that. If you're using a rubric that takes a complicated verbal description and maps it to a number, just replace the number with a word, or like this is really good, or very good, excellent, meets expectations, revision needed, incomplete. There's a number of ways that you can do that. It's really simple. It's even simple to make. I rolled my eyes heavily earlier when Steve mentioned Canvas and Blackboard, but even those LMSs can be rigged to display marks that indicate progress rather than numbers if you know how to work the system.
Can we work them to be more traditional and give our feedback in Latin again? Bene, optime,
Absolutely. I
pulcre.
mean, yeah, you certainly can do that if you choose to try. I don't know how unless U of M students are pretty smart. They probably know all that Latin. I don't know.
No.
No,
They'll just
can't
Google it.
attest.
So the last part, the last pillar is this reassessment without penalty. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So it's in feedback loops, anything that you learn that's of any consequence, you do it iteratively. Okay. You try something, it usually doesn't go perfectly the first time or even well enough the first time. You have some idea, you have this task that you're performing, uh, uh, and you have some idea of what a successful attempt looks like. And then maybe it meets that level of success, and maybe it doesn't. And you don't do it once. This is not a one and done thing. I mean, if you're learning to play the piano, you don't sit down for the very first time at the piano and play, and your teacher tells you you're never going to play the piano again, or wow, you're a star and you're on the piano. It's an iterative process. You get feedback from the teacher, or you record yourself and you listen back to it, and you make sense of the feedback. You feed it back into a loop and just keep trying this out. What we don't do is penalize people for engaging in a natural feedback loop process. That seems sort of inhuman. Okay, when we're talking about things like playing the piano, imagine like I'm asking you to go to the piano and play me an A flat major scale, and you mess it up. And so I'll let you play this scale again, but I'm going to tie three of your fingers together and see if you can play it. Okay, I'm penalizing you for making a mistake the first time, and I'm setting you up for failure the second time. I thought, why am I doing this? I mean, why don't I just let you use all 10 of your fingers the second time, just like you got to use all 10 of your fingers the first time? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And so first of all, it makes a lot of sense to allow the reattempt to begin with. Okay, we don't just say, this is the one and only time you ever get a chance to play an A flat major scale, and this is it. This is your whole life in front of you right now. That's nuts. And when we give the reattempt, we don't penalize people or put a monkey on their back, literally tying their fingers together to make that happen. So reattempting without penalty just means, like, in your classroom, this is also an iterative learning process, okay, whether it's calculus or philosophy or whatever. And so if students, insofar as it makes sense, okay, both for the assessment and for the time frame and the workload, students should be allowed to reattempt anything that is important that could benefit from a feedback loop. They should be allowed to do it, and without penalty. Okay, so that's what reattempts without penalty means. It's literally what it says on the tin.
I
Now, what
always
that
like
looks
that.
like in a particular class depends on the class, and it depends on the instructor and how much workload you're willing to accept. Okay, but that's the philosophy behind it.
Yeah. So luckily, that was the one part that I had been doing a lot of before I read your book. So it wasn't that hard to adopt a lot of that, but that was because of Eric Mazur, because Eric's
Mm-hmm.
always included lots of that with reading assignments, with perusal, with the readiness
Right,
assurance activities where you take the same test over again, but now with your whole team. And
right.
it just goes back to the fact that we all learn by making mistakes. Why should we penalize our students for doing the most important part of learning, which is learning from your mistakes?
Hmm.
So,
Every game that you play and every sport that we play is the fun of it comes from the feedback loop. Okay,
right.
you're playing Monopoly with friends or something like that, or cards, and you make a move, and then the other person makes a move, and then you got to respond to their move. Okay, and you realize later, oh, that was a terrible move, and I got to do something different the next time, or that was a good move, and I need to double down on that the next time. So feedback is the source of all human enjoyment of anything. Okay, that isn't just rank pleasure. I mean, it's just like real deep meaning and pleasure that we have as human beings. And what makes us partially human is the ability to accept and deal with feedback. And we cut that out of the loop at our own peril. And I think that I think I'm beginning to understand why so many students today, so many high school students are opting out of college, because they can look at certain colleges and the so-called typical college experience, and they see no feedback. They just see like a bunch of pointless busy work that goes on for 4 years, and then what? Nobody knows. And so they're just like, no, I think I'm just going to skip it. So if you want to suck all the fun out of something, disconnect it from the feedback loop.
Yeah. You brought up that what feedback or what reassessment can look like can be very different in different courses. And I was thinking about the lab class I teach, where most of the assessment is also most of the deliverables, which are typically reports. And they come in various genres and various formats for different
Sure.
audiences and different reasons. But writing, people who teach writing do this automatically without even questioning it because they have the draft revision
Hmm.
cycle just built into the craft of teaching
Right.
writing. And so it makes me think like, well, okay, why don't we do that with exams? Why don't you give students a draft exam and then have them take it and then revise it and then take the real exam?
You certainly could do it that way. A lot of people do, in fact, or do a like a two-stage exam where the first you give us the exam out and it's done in groups first, or I think it's done in individually first and then completed in groups. There's a whole science behind that, and that's something people do, or to simply give an exam or a quiz and then like grade it, give it back, and then a week later you get to retake it, same exam, but all the questions have been kept the same sort of scope and style, but the details are changed. Like there's all kinds of ways to make this work.
Yeah,
And you're right. I mean, you're right, Tim. I mean, our friends in the humanities have been doing this like for literally centuries, and we're just now catching up in the STEM disciplines.
and doing it with dialogue is, of course, very
Hmm.
old technique going back to,
Hmm.
you know, Aristotle and Plato. And so giving an oral exam is, of course, the gold standard of understanding how much a student has grown. But the
Hmm.
problem is it doesn't scale. And
That's
so when
right.
I read the case studies and saw that some people were requiring students come to their office hours to do the reassessment, I'm like, wow, nobody comes to my office hours unless they want to complain about a grade I gave them,
Not a grade.
which is a waste of everyone's time.
Hmm.
And so I sat down and thought, well, maybe I can use this to address the issue of scaling. And so, who do I really want to see in my office? I want to see the people at the lower third of the distribution of students, the ones who are really struggling, because they're the ones that I have a chance to really improve. I don't want to see the students who are complaining they're not getting an A and they're getting a B instead, right? I'm not going to be able
Hmm.
to help them. They're tuned into the wrong thing. They're like the students who are sitting in front of you in the bus. And but the ones who are really struggling, that's where I feel I should spend my time. So I worked out a scheme that if you got below some value on the individual part of your readiness assurance activity, this is the two-step
Right.
test that Eric
Right.
taught me. If you got below a certain number, then you were eligible to come in for a retake. And that limited the number of students. But I had like 40 students in the class, and I taught my teaching at my TA how to do this as well. So we could handle about 5 students each during our office hours. And we realized that even if more people showed up, doing it as a group activity wasn't such a bad idea
Hmm.
either. And so it utilized the time of my office hours so much better. And you could actually see the growth while they were there. You saw the learning gains. And it was the
Hmm.
first time ever in my entire career that I actually saw something like that work. Now, the students weren't happy with it, but I was, because I actually
Hmm.
saw some of the poorer students actually learn something. Whereas before, I had
Hmm.
made it so student centric, do this, do this, do this, and you'll get an A. So they all got an
Right.
A and they didn't know anything. And I was giving A's to students who should have gotten C's.
Yeah. False
So
positives.
I fixed that with that suggestion of, from your book. And so I'm very grateful to having read that book. So thank you. But I at least I feel that's one way to help with the scaling of oral exams. Tim, on the other
Yeah.
hand, decided to do it for all of his students.
That's
How'd
because
that
I'm
work out, Tim?
insane. Uh, so since it came up, it was actually a really positive experience, partly for the reasons that Steve was already sharing, but let me put it to you. When was the last time students gave you unsolicited feedback on your midterm that said, this was the best midterm exam I've ever taken? That happened to me this semester. And
Yeah.
I'm like, what reality is this first? But uh,
You're just trolling
yeah,
me. Stop pulling my leg.
yeah, but it was because the students actually had the chance to have time to gain deep knowledge of something. And that's not something that traditional curriculum affords them
Hmm.
very often. And they
Yeah.
recognized that there was something different happening and they felt like, I think I actually learned something from this experience. And it's
Yeah, I get that a
unfortunate
lot
that that's a
too.
contrast to their normal experience, but I think it indicates that there is value to this activity.
Yeah, I mean, there's the effect of I forget the name. What is the effect where like you always rate the new thing higher than the old thing, and if no
Oh yeah,
matter what it
recency
is.
bias.
Recency bias, right? So I mean, I think there is that, but I think it's something to that too. There's a lot that's been said about the so-called disengagement crisis on higher education campuses these days, but I think the people who write about this are looking through the wrong end of the telescope. They look at students and see disengagement and say there's a disengagement crisis. But if you flip that around, it's like, well, why is there a disengagement crisis? Well, take a look at what's going on and walk into 100 classrooms randomly sampled across the United States, college universities. You're going to see 99 boring lectures happening with a bunch of
Hmm.
traditional grades. And it's just like, I think students really want, today's students especially, more so than ever, really want to learn, really want to be engaged and have their minds tapped into and expanded. They're not good at expressing this, and they come to expect that this is just never going to happen. And so when they encounter something that's counter to their expectations, there could be some friction. But in the end, I think students really want this sort of thing happening, and this is what they're really coming to college for. And they're getting disengaged because they're not getting it. They're getting just the same old. And so
Hmm.
I think a way out of the way out of the disengagement crisis, insofar that's even a thing, is to look in the mirror for us and decide how are we going to do something different that gives students what they truly want, even if they aren't necessarily willing or able to express it.
Yeah, I think that's something that the K-12 system has always just taken as their ethos is K through 12 teachers understand that if they don't engage the students and make them care, the students won't care. And they center so much around their instruction around creating engagement and creating the desire to learn and making students realize that this is valuable to them. And so why suddenly at the university are we like, no, it's the students' fault. We don't have to be teachers. We don't have to create value and make the students want to engage. We just have to be smart. And
Right.
it's very
That's well,
self-defeating.
the systems are optimized to produce what they produce. Okay, and so
Oh
our
yeah.
higher education systems for almost 1,000 years now have been optimized towards producing not they haven't been optimized for teaching. That's for sure. Not all of them, not the whole system. I mean, many schools, many small colleges in particular, and two-year institutions especially are very, very good at this, are really optimized for teaching and student engagement, and they get amazing results. But you never hear about them because they're not the massive flagship, elite four-year institutions. They're just like, Kalamazoo Community College or Northwest Michigan
Hmm.
College or Albion College or all of these smaller schools they're flying under the radar but have amazing things going on at them.
Yeah, this is something Steve and I have discussed as well. Like if you look at the teaching at HBCUs, for example, it's often
Mhm.
amazing. Those people are
Yeah,
there to teach, and
HBCUs
they're great
especially. Yeah.
teachers. It's what they do. So we should be learning. I say, like the University of Michigan, pointing the finger back at ourselves. There's a lot of learning that needs to happen here
Hmm.
institutionally. So the last topic I want to visit today, I'm looking at the clock now, is you mentioned, of course, student resistance and that there can be friction when adopting these practices. So, what are the lessons learned or what's the advice for people who want to adopt a grading for growth a strategy in part or even in whole? How do they get through that activation barrier and get students on board?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can tell you what doesn't work. Most of my books are about telling you what doesn't work, in fact. So what doesn't work is coming in guns blazing to your classroom and saying, like, I've got this fantastic new innovative technique that I'm going to try out on you. Okay, and that never works because students have incredibly sensitive radar to being experimented upon, and they don't appreciate that. It's like look, I'm barely hanging on in my university classes, and some of them are saying this, and I don't want you messing with what I just barely know how to work. So for me, what's worked is appealing to just the overall naturalness of alternative grading. Okay, so I mentioned feedback loops. Feedback loops are every student, every human being instinctively knows what a feedback loop is and how it works because we have all learned everything this way. And so if you position alternative grading practices to be, we're simply instantiating a feedback loop here, something you already know how to use. So you can just keep appealing to that naturalness. And I do this activity with my students on the first day of every class. I ask them two questions. I sometimes do this with faculty too. I say, tell me something you're good at doing. Okay, just tell me something you're good at doing. So, I'm good at baking brownies. I'm good at snowboarding. I'm good at playing the guitar or whatever. And it's kind of fun. You get to learn some stuff about people. And it's interesting that people will open up to a complete stranger about this thing that's really personal to them. I almost never mention school, by the way. It's always like something with music, sports, or personal cooking, food related. And then I ask them, how did you get good at that? What was the process by which you got good at snowboarding, at baking brownies, at playing the piano, whatever? And it's the same story every single time. It's a feedback loop. Okay, I tried it and I persisted. I had to have persistence. I learned from failure. I made a lot of mistakes. I didn't just make mistakes. I analyzed the mistakes and I learned from the mistakes. Okay, making mistakes is not learning, but learning, picking the mistakes apart and turning them into action, that's learning. And it's the same story. And so I said, great, you fully understand how to learn anything at this point, because it doesn't matter what the topic is. You learn it the
whole
same
secret.
way. Right. That's the secret. And if we're trying, and so all I'm doing in this class is aligning your grades and your work with that. So it's not weird. It's not even new. It's as old as you are, as it's older than you are. Okay, so what's weird is the way it's normally done. Okay, by taking your work, and we're going to pretend that this is the one time you ever get to demonstrate skill on the chain rule or whatever, or on Stokes theorem or whatever, on this one exam, and I'm going to stick a number on this exam, and we're going to pretend that number measures something, and that I can treat it like any other number in terms of statistics, and we're going to do a whole bunch of crazy statistics on things and turn this into a letter at the end of the course, and we're going to pretend that letter accurately represents every person that has an A has the same level of understanding as every other person who gets an A. And that's just all hogwash. And I think students have very good BS detectors when it comes to this sort of thing. So for me, I just pointed out to them, like, all that stuff that we normally do in class is crazy. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. But what does make sense is feedback loops. And so all we're doing is we're giving you chances to engage with the feedback loop and keep trying with my feedback until, success happens. And success is inevitable if you just do this. Okay. And so convincing them that this is not some weird alien scheme to screw them out of a good grade that's the quickest route to adoption, as far as I'm concerned, with my students. And if I can explain to students that works, and also make sure it's also important to, on my end, I've got to design a system that's simple enough for students to be able to follow. Like if it's really complicated, like all kinds of crazy moving parts and a ton of work, and that's all gonna fall flat. So I've got to design a system of grades that's simple, that's easy to understand, fits on a 3x5 card, or a Post-it note, and so students can work with the system themselves and get used to it. Those two things, the simplicity and the naturalness of it all, that's the key to engagement and adoption. If I can do that, and insofar as I've ever been successful in doing that, I've never had a problem with students buying into this. The buy-in only fails when I fail at one of those two things.
Well, I sure had a lot of problems when I tried it, but I think I made it too complicated. So I tried using the idea of a grading table, which gets complicated very quickly. And
It can, yeah.
and then I also tried because, again, in the past, I had a series of things that I hoped if students just did these things, followed the feedback loops, and kept getting better, that they would learn. But when students don't want to learn, and I'm teaching a course that's required, and a lot of students don't understand why they're even in the class, they end up cheating a lot. And with ChatGPT, it was even easier to cheat than before. So they all cheated on perusal. They all like put in a definition. They found ways around. They were able to paste into the window, even though I set it so you can't
Supposed to
do
do
it.
that,
But they
yeah.
all know how to do that. One student had read the 900-page book, done the annotations for the entire term in 2 days. And when I looked at the timestamps, I could see how much was written. This student was reading and writing at 60 words a minute based on the timestamps. So I know he was cheating. And it's really sad that they did this. But they can do that in almost, they're really smart kids. So they find ways around actually doing it. They do what I ask them to do. Then I have to give them an A. And then our university did something really stupid. They created this website called Atlas, where they show the historical grades of every single class and every single instructor. So students ended up choosing my class based on the fact that was giving 85% A's because I did what I said I would do. And I knew that I had to change it. And I even wrote a little disclaimer when they signed up for classes. I had a website. I said, this is going to be different. Those are because of my failed experiments. I'm doing something different now. There's going to be a final exam in this class as a recertification of grades. And the grade average I'm predicting will be a B plus, not an A minus. That little change. Nobody read that. They all, insisted they had to take my section. It was crazy. So they all tried to get into my section. And then when I explained how I was doing it this year, they all flipped out. And boy, was it bad. So, but that's because, I've been doing experiments my whole life on teaching. And, I make a contract with the students. If I say this is what you need to do to get an A and they do it, I'm going to give them an A, even if they don't know the material. But I was tired of that. I wanted them to learn the material. And
Right.
by doing all of these feedback loops, I could easily see who deserved an A and who didn't. But I still think I did it too mathematically. And I think that I need to find ways to back off and make more meaningful marks. Like even in grading a final exam, don't give numerical grades, but meets expectations, approaching
Right.
expectations, something like that.
Yeah. Or you just say like passing is an 80. You have two grades on this exam, 100 or zero. Okay.
Yeah,
Uh, and to get 100, you have to like mostly get like 80% of the work right.
right,
So now we're playing with the numbers, right? So I mean, 100 is
right.
not 100 anything. It's just a label that means like
Well, that's what I
fantastic, great,
did.
success. And so it still has
Yeah,
a number on that, but the catch but you might
but
end up
it,
with a zero. But you're only going to get it's a binary grading system, and so but the catch is you get to do it 3 times. Okay, and we take the highest possible score, and so that's one way to kind of sneak a little bit of four pillars action into an existing course is to say like we're going to
right.
keep the numbers because everything in the course is designed for numbers, but we're going to make those numbers, mean something different.
To say that your book didn't revolutionize the way I think about teaching would be an understatement. So I really thank you so
Very
much
kind,
for
Steve.
writing
Thanks.
that. And it's gonna take me a long time to actually learn how to put my own feedback loops in for teaching. And I hope
Yeah.
that people at our institution will continue doing learning cycles so that we can compare what we're doing and give ourselves feedback. And hopefully you'll come and maybe join one of these and give us some feedback to improve how we're doing with the teaching.
I hope so,
Um,
and I really appreciate that you mentioned that particular process because we have to engage in the same feedback loop processes that we expect our students to engage in. I mean, it wouldn't be
right,
fair otherwise, and so a lot of professors find that super super uncomfortable, especially when it comes to teaching. But the fact is that teaching is not an art, it's not a science, it's like a craft, like woodworking or making pottery. It's like you just got to keep doing it and getting feedback, and it's a feedback loop all the way down. And so teaching especially, I would say. So yeah, I mean, the University of Michigan's doing a great job with this. I was there last year actually on campus to participate in a panel discussion about alternative grading. I just remember that.
Oh, I
So
didn't even see
I
that.
had yeah, I had a great experience with the CRLT, of course, put
Right.
this on, and the CRLT, of course, is a world-class outfit that a great resource for U of M faculty to tap into as well.
So,
Well,
what else should engineering educators know about grading for growth and any new projects you're working on? This is your chance to
Sure.
promote anything you like. And by the way, we'd like you to maybe give us some links to put in the show notes for people
Absolutely.
to sign up for your Substack because I get those emails and enjoy reading it, reading it
Great.
all the time. So,
So I could think of three things that engineering educators specifically can take note of. First of all, engineers often have a concern about rigor, academic rigor of a course. And I've gotten this concern from engineering educators before, that if you allow reattempts without penalty, it dumbs the course down, basically. I wanted to say it does not have to be that way. And if you talk to any of my students and ask them, are you taking a dumbed down version of discrete math, they will laugh you out of the room because they because I allow reattempts without penalty, I can hold my standards for success very high if I want to. Like, I don't have to put up with really bad work. I can just say, you got to retry this. Okay. If you miss a single note, I can say, you got to go retry this. And you get to retry this as much as you want within reason, within the bounds of the calendar and without penalty. But, you got to retry it. And so you can actually, as an engineer, hold very high standards in your classes if you move away from the numerical auditing side of things and allow, feedback loops in the mix. And another thing, too, is engineers specifically can look to your own discipline, because every engineer doesn't have to take, but really ought to take the professional engineering exam, the PE exam. And guess what? I mean, if you take the PE exam, and the PE exam has a passing rate of roughly 50% on the first time takers. So, but that's not the end of it. That doesn't mean like you can never be an engineer. You just got to wait. I believe it's 1 quarter. I mean, you can take it once a quarter and up to 3 times a year. And so all this reattempting without penalty and feedback loops is actually built into the very DNA of how engineers are certified to be professional engineers. And so if you adopt this in your classroom, you're actually kind of getting students used to the idea of exactly what they're going to be needing to do once they get their degrees. And the third thing I would say for engineers specifically is we've had a lot of research in the last 10, 15 years about the attrition rates of really talented students from STEM disciplines, especially engineering courses. And the greatest one of those was a paper by Freeman in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2014 with shocking statistics about how many students are leaving the STEM disciplines. And it's not because they're stupid or can't handle the math. It's because they're getting just buzzsawed out by inactive pedagogies. And now I believe we're beginning to realize that the grading system plays a role too. So if you want to retain these really bright students that show up on your doorstep on day one, maybe think about mixing up the situation with your grades. And as far as just self-promotion, I only have one thing, and that is the second edition of the Flip Learning book, which we started this podcast mentioning, called Flip Learning, A Guide for Higher Education Faculty. I am currently at work on the second edition of this, and it's going to be a big change through the first edition, because 10 years have passed since the first edition of that book, and a lot has happened in higher ed in the last 10 years, of course, COVID and AI being foremost among those. And this is a very interesting time to take a fresh look at the whole concept of flipped learning. The research on flipped learning has just exploded over the last 10 years, and I'll be working on a research summary and bringing case studies into the mix, a la the case studies in the alternative grading book this fall. And you can expect to see that at some point in 2026.
awesome.
fantastic.
Well, if you can sneak me a draft of that, I'd love to be an early reader. I
I would love
use
to. I would love to. I need all the feedback I can get. It's a feedback process too, all the way
Absolutely.
down.
Good. Well, with that, I think it's time to wrap it up for the day. Robert, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the show today. We really appreciate all your insights and the time that you spent to get the word out about alternative grading to the audience out there.
Hey, thanks, Tim and Steve. Thanks to both of you for having me. It's been fun.
All right. Well, thank you.
All
See you
right.
later.
Yep. To the
Bye
audience
bye.
out there, see you next time.